Okay, hello, my name is Rob York. I work for UC Berkeley. I am an extension specialist based out of Blodgett Forest Research Station. Hopefully you can see that picture there of me at Blodgett Forest Research Station. Actually, I'm really happy to give this webinar, and I want to thank Lenya and Jeff for organizing this webinar series. I think it's a really great idea. Very humbled that they asked me to provide this webinar. So I'm imagining that the folks listening to this webinar are basically kind of in three categories. One is that their profession is fire, so firefighters, fire managers, and they are involved with the very important job of increasing the use of prescribed fire on the landscape. The other kind of group that I imagine that are out there are resource managers, so foresters and resource managers who, they manage natural resources and they really are interested in working with fire folks, right, to increase the amount of prescribed fire that happens on their land. And then the other group is landowners who are interested in having prescribed fire done on their land. And so I've tried to focus this webinar on those three groups. Really importantly, I want to talk about how those three groups are going to interact in the future if prescribed fire is going to be successful in terms of using it in California. Okay, so my personal story that I want to start out with here, this is a picture of me in 2007, and it's really when I started using prescribed fire as part of my job. Since then, I've definitely expanded using prescribed fire. It's always been actually a minor component of what I do, but it's been the most interesting component of what I do as a researcher and as a forest manager. And the point I wanted to make here is that, this is me back in 2007, and I feel like I've come such a long way in terms of understanding fire, the ecological role they can have, and how to do prescribed fires. And that's with me, over 12 years, having it be a pretty minor component of my job. And so what I'm really excited about is the direction in California that we can really the expansion of prescribed fire, because there's just so many good skills out there that, especially on the professional fire fighting side, the professional fire suppression side, because those skills that all those fire suppression folks have really do, I think, translate really well in terms of doing prescribed fire. And then certainly I think there's a lot of motivation that comes from the ecological understanding of the role that fire has. And again, I think we have that knowledge. We have a pretty good understanding of the role that fire should have in the mixed-conifer forest of the Sierra Nevada. So I think we have the motivation, we have the skills. I think it's a really exciting time that we're going to see prescribed fire really increase a lot over the land. Personally, I think it's a necessary step that we have to take as a society in California. Okay, so another personal story here, Sierra San Pedro Martir. This is in a picture of a forest in Baja, California in Mexico, and this is often used as a reference forest, kind of reference for what we should be shooting for if we want a forest that to look like the forest that was maintained with natural fire. And that's because this forest did not have aggressive fire suppression for a long time. And so we can kind of see the structure here and what natural fire maintains in terms of a structure. And this is a picture from a tower that was here on the Sierra San Pedro Martir. So I tried to get a view that was as large a scale as possible. And what struck me, and this is a few years ago that I went down there, what struck me was just from this scale, from a large, or like a point high up on the in the sky, we see at a certain scale not a lot of variability. I think when we zero in and get down to the acre level or the sub-acre level, we do see lots of variability. But at this broader scale, it actually kind of looks homogeneous. And I know that's not something we necessarily manage for these days. But my point is that I think that it's important to have, I have this reference in my mind when I'm doing a prescribed fire. So I think about this structure and how I can go towards it in terms of using prescribed fire. And I think it is important to have this kind of vision when doing prescribed fire. We have to have a vision for what our ultimate outcome, what we want it to be. Okay, so here's the outline of what I want to cover in this talk. I was asked to cover some basic topics here. So background on fire in mixed-conifer forest, why a landowner might want to use prescribed fire. I'm going to talk a little bit about the best timing for prescribed fires, meeting objectives, generally objective-based burning and what that means. Talk a little bit about return intervals for burning and what we should be shooting for in terms of how often to burn. And then I also want to focus on some real general topics about just kind of how we can work together to increase prescribed fire in the future, this idea of the gatekeepers of prescribed fire, who's responsible for doing prescribed fire, and then I've kind of introduced what I think of as the fire management triangle. It's a very kind of central theme of this talk here. and then I'm going to end it with some basic questions that I think fire managers have to ask of landowners and of foresters when doing prescribed fire. Okay, so I want to go back in time a little bit here, get in the Wayback Machine, and go back to 1974. So 1974 was this game-changing event in California when it comes to the management of natural resources, specifically forest natural resources. So 1974 is when the modern forest practice rules, as we know them now, were developed. And the key thing that started this off was the identification of soil water as a public trust resource. Okay, so it invokes this idea that soil and water is valuable to everyone, not just the individual landowner where the soil or water occurs. It's a public trust resource. Okay, and also importantly, in 1974, it identified kind of like who the people were that were responsible for this public trust resource. And it developed this thing called professional foresters. And it kind of identified those as the gatekeepers, but how it evolved was that they weren't the single gatekeepers, and kind of how we have it now is registered professional foresters they're not the only ones responsible for forests. It's really a collaboration among those professional foresters and landowners that own forest land, and then the regulators that are involved with regulating activity. So my point here is that this was really a key point in the history of natural resource management in California that has evolved since then, but it was really a key point when you look back in time. And I think that right now is very similar to 1974, but more with fire, right? So I think what's happened recently, and this is just the title page of the Little Hoover Commission, this is kind of one example of a lot of people paying attention to prescribed fire and really the recognition that we need to think about prescribed fire differently. And I think it really is another game-changing moment in California. And I see similarities between now, or 2018 and 2019 now, and 1974. Because I think we have recently gone through this process of identifying fire as an ecological process, a public resource even, that is essential to the functioning of forests. The question I think we have now is who's going to be the gatekeepers, right? We don't have registered professional prescribed fire burners right now. So who are the gatekeepers? How are we going to increase prescribed fire? How are we going to do that across the landscape? I mean, it'll be really interesting to see how it develops. One thing I know, or at least I would offer in terms of my opinion, would be that a collaboration is going to have to develop between landowners, between foresters, regulators, and fire managers. So to kind of develop to borrow a point here from popular culture. So if you're a Thor fan here, a fan of the Thor movies, then you recognize this character. It's Heimdall. So he's the ultimate gatekeeper, right? So he was the guy who singly responsible for people going in and out of Asgaard, which is of course the alien planet. So he's definitely a resource the public can trust. My point here is that it's not really just one person that's going to be responsible for this public resource. It's got to be a collaboration. So Asgaard and forests will need more than just one gatekeeper. Okay, sorry for that digression into pop culture. I'm coming back into basic forest ecology here. I think there are two main reasons for using fire as a management tool. At least I categorize them into these very broad categories that people have. So one reason invokes this idea that the process of fire is the most important thing. And so when we think about the process of fire as being an important ecological component, then that kind of gets us towards thinking that we need to have fire because it's inherently good. So the idea here is that fire maintained mixed conifer forests for millennia, and we've taken that out of the ecosystem, and we need to find ways to put it back in. The other, I think, reason that we have is more objective-based. It's not the first process-based category is more kind of like an ecological philosophy, I think, as opposed to that second reason here being more objective-based. So this is the idea that fire can do a lot of good for the values that we have right now, for the objectives that we want to meet. So especially this idea of preventing high-severity fire. We don't want that as a society in California. We know prescribed fire can go a long ways towards preventing those high-severity fires. Okay, so I like to look at this map of shame every once in a while. So I think we have this recognition that we or at least a lot of people from different sectors would like to see more prescribed fire, and we're definitely, I think there's a pretty good consensus that we're not there right now. We don't have nearly enough prescribed fire across California, across the mixed-conifer forest to make a difference. And this is exemplified by what I call the map of shame. So this is a map that anyone can see, a map that Air Resources Board maintains. This map is developed because anytime someone does a prescribed burn project, they have to make sure it complies with air quality regulations. And so a prescribed burn project is registered with Air Resources Board, and when a prescribed burn is happening, it shows up on this map of California. And so this is just an example. This was a day in October, a really good burn day. So conditions were good. There was no wind. Fuel moisture was good. Really just a good burn day across this mixed conifer forest. And yet we see 1, 2, 3, 5, or if you don't count this one up on the north, it's probably more in the Cascade Range. Only 4 fires occurring, prescribed fires occurring in the mixed conifer forest. And I call this the map of shame because really this is not nearly enough. We want to see way more than this. We want to actually increase this by at least an order of magnitude when it comes to prescribed fire actually making a difference across the mixed conifer forest. And so the question is, how do we get there? How do we get to where we want to be in terms of seeing a map that has a lot more of these little fire symbols on a good burn day and not just 4 of them? Okay, so I would suggest that we think about in fire, we have triangles, right? We have the fire triangle. And so this is what I suggest is currently the fire suppression triangle. So currently when there's a fire, right, especially on private land, our response is it has to be, I think, is to suppress the fire. And so there's kind of 3 different components to it. Of course, we have firefighting, and that's a component of the fire suppression triangle. They put out the fire. There's also a landowner component to it as well, right? So the landowner owns that land where the fire is and has certain resources and certain knowledge about the land that is sometimes shared with the firefighters. And if it's a forest land, forest is managed by someone. The forest could be managed by the landowner, or it is often managed by a professional forester or a silviculturalist. So a silviculturalist is someone who manages the forest for certain objectives on behalf of the landowner. And that silviculturalist influences the fire suppression triangle because they manage the forest to create a certain structure that it now has, right? And so that structure can have high fire hazard or it can have low fire hazard. So often the degree of hazard is dependent upon how that forest was managed in the past. So I would argue that we need a new triangle. We need to think about a new triangle with similar but different legs of the triangle, if you will. So I would call this the fire management triangle. So the idea that I'm getting at is what people need to be involved to start managing fire. So how do we manage prescribed fire? What I'm saying here is that firefighters need to become fire managers and actually use those good skills that they have and apply them towards prescribed fire. And then we also have this, I think, a basic need to landowners, when it comes to landowners and silviculturalists, for them to think differently about fire as well. So rather than a landowner wanting to not have any fire on their land at all, this idea of a pyro-landowner, that's a landowner that wants fire to occur, the right type of fire for them and their objectives, but they want fire to occur on their land. And then we have pyro-silviculturalists who know how to manage a forest so that it can allow prescribed fire to occur. So I would suggest that we kind of think about this fire management triangle as the way to move forward in terms of collaborative work towards doing more prescribed fire. Okay, so what do I mean exactly by firefighter versus fire manager? What I'm talking about here is that, I think in the public's image of firefighters, this image on the left here, so it's someone to suppress fire, and of course that component of fire, fire suppression is super important for us to have. I live in the forest, and I'm certainly appreciative of, the many times that my house would have burned down if it hadn't been for fire suppression efforts. But I think, what we're looking for now is a firefighter to also be this image on the upper right. So a person that's not only putting out a fire, but also a person who is applying good fire to the landscape. The bottom here, what I have is I'm sure, again, I'm certainly appreciative of firefighters, and I think the public is as well, as they should be. And we see often images during wildfires. We see images and signs that say, "Thank you, wildfires." I could not find an image or a sign that said, "Thank you, fire manager," or "Thank you for doing a prescribed fire." And I think, culturally, what we kind of need to have happen eventually is for, this same kind of appreciation that the public has for fire managers when they are doing prescribed fire. Okay, so landowner versus a pyro-landowner, I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of forest landowners out there are still very wary of fire on their land. This is actually a picture of my 10 acres of forest land that I have, so my little 10 acres of heaven that I have in the mixed-conifer forest. As you can see, I have fire on my land a little bit. These are little windrows that I've been burning, and I've been doing a little bit of broadcast burning as well, but vast majority, I would say, of my neighbors would rather not have fire on their land for totally logical reasons. So pyro-landowners are those landowners that actually want good fire to occur on their land. And there aren't a lot of them out there, I would say. So I think the key here is like building on that population that we do have and increasing the numbers. I think the key here is early success with those collaborators that we do have. This idea of prescribed burn associations, I think, also is a good lever for us to have in terms of creating more of that pyro-landowner population. Okay, silviculture versus pyro-silviculture. Silviculture for a long time, I think, meant managing for timber. Silviculture is much more than that. For those silviculturists out there, we need to recognize that silviculture is a very broad profession and a broad field of study that includes managing for different objectives. But there is, I think, or for a long time in California, silviculture has meant managing for timber. So this picture on the left, in the past, silviculturally, this was actually great because there's no evidence of fire occurring here. Therefore, the timber was protected. As opposed to the picture on the right, fire did occur here, right? Timber was still mostly protected. There was a little bit of a compromise in this sense. In this case, this picture is actually from a fire that occurred, a prescribed fire that occurred, I think it was 12 years ago or so. And it was kind of a hot fire. You can see the scorch heights here on this ponderosa pine are getting up there. But my point here is that like a pyro-silviculturalist sees this stand structure as highly favorable because it's ready to accept a fire. It's ready to accept prescribed fire. We didn't get there overnight. This actually took a lot of work to get to this point. It took a lot of silviculture work to manage the forest so that it could have another low severity fire, a low severity prescribed fire. Okay, so just reviewing the fire management triangle, my point here is that I think it's all three of these. It's just going to take, I think, a little bit of changing of attitude and changing of I think the skill sets are there. It's just changing how we apply the skills in the future to allow more prescribed fire to happen. Okay, this is just a quote that I have from my friendly neighborhood battalion chief when I showed him this stand here that we were going to do a prescribed fire, and this is on university land here that I used to manage. And he said, well, that's some low-hanging fruit, and he's certainly right. Like, this is a really nice structure for us to be able to burn in. My point here is that it didn't just come this way naturally. We had to work through prescribed fire and through mechanical treatments as well, through harvesting and thinning treatments. We had to create a structure like this so that it was a low-hanging fruit at some point that we could maintain with prescribed fire. Okay, so what are the goals that a fire manager would have for burning? I think that there's general recognition that we need to shift from strategic placement of prescribed fire. So in other words, fuel breaks that cover a relatively small amount of the landscape towards larger landscape level restoration. Okay, so this is the idea of just increasing the overall level of burning that we do and thinking beyond shaded fuel breaks. Because when you think about a fuel break, the idea with a shaded fuel break is fire suppression, right? It's not to allow good fire to occur. It's to put out fire so that it doesn't spread across the landscape. Okay, so I think there's this shift that's going to have to happen in terms of how we think about placement of fire. Reducing the severity of the next wildfire on all acres. This is related to that point above. Okay, think that the main goal that we have is reducing fire severity of the next wildfire, which we know from lots and lots of study that it's all about the surface fuels. Okay, so the surface fuels we know are still the highest priority of the various components of the forest that we have out there. We have the surface fuels, we have ladder fuels, we have canopy fuels. We know from decades of research that it's those surface fuels that are of the highest priority. Ladder fuels are important as well as our canopy fuels, but the highest priority remains to be the surface fuels. And prescribed fire is just a really good way to do that. And actually from a management, when you think about it from a management perspective, it's just so hard. There's no really another good tool that's as good as fire when it comes to reducing surface fuels. another personal story here of why I'm into prescribed fire is because when I first started doing it, I realized just how efficient it was. And this is me coming from a management background. I realized how just good and efficient and cheap, actually, fire was at reducing surface fuels. And I saw fire doing the work for me. And I thought, wow, if I didn't have fire here and I had to try to think of another way to get rid of all the surface fuels, it would be a lot harder to do it without prescribed fire. And so, I think there's also that kind of utilitarian aspect of prescribed fire, and that it can actually help us meet our objectives quite efficiently. And then this third point here is, in terms of the goals for burning, maximizing longevity of the treatment. So effective prescribed fires that actually do reduce surface fuels, because we don't have the resources to do to have inefficient burns. We have to have our burns count when we do them. So maximizing longevity of the treatment is certainly an important goal that we have. Okay, a famous fire scientist friend of mine, a good friend, said something that I've always remembered since he said it. It's a low severity fire begets low severity fire. The idea that once we do a prescribed fire, a low severity fire, it sure is a lot easier, or we can expect the next wildfire to be low severity, and also, like, from a prescribed fire perspective, it makes that next fire easier. And I know that from experience. The more that we do prescribed fire in a given area, the easier it becomes over time. This is just a graph. I don't have a lot of graphs in this webinar, but I do have a few. This is just torching probability. So this y-axis over here is the probability that we would get torching occurring under severe wildfire conditions. And so on the x-axis here, we have a control, and then the area where we've experimentally done prescribed fire, and then experimentally done mechanical only treatments without fire, and then mechanical plus fire. And then we have that is the torching probability of stands before doing any treatment, and then 1 year after, and then 7 years after. So what I'm showing here is the control, so torching probability, you could think of that as a metric of hazard, right, of fire hazard. The higher up on the y-axis, the higher the fire hazard. So the control of the fire hazard went up over time. And what I'm showing here is the effect, the very kind of really, I think, striking effect of prescribed fire on torching probability. So this is when we use prescribed fire. Torching probability went down close to 0, and then mechanical plus fire close to 0 as well. And it persisted for quite a while, at least 7 years is what and we're still tracking this over time, but the effectiveness of that fire persisted for at least 7 years, and it continues to persist. We know that it can persist longer than 7 years, depending on the level of surface fuel consumption that the fire does. All right, another quote here, not from a famous fire scientist, but a firefighter who's just as smart. These forests want to burn, all right? So a firefighter friend of mine said this, and in some ways he's right? We've got to be careful about treating forests like as if they are, or we've got to be careful about humanizing forests. But in some ways, like if you think of along these terms, kind of help us motivate wanting to do prescribed fire. If you think of a forest wanting to burn, and if we so how we, what we're doing now in terms of prescribed fire and treatments in general is we are just modifying the way in which it burns, because it's going to burn. You folks out there have probably heard this before. Fire, it's not a matter of if a fire occurs, it's a matter of when it occurs, right? So the question is, how is it going to behave? And we know that we can modify the way that it behaves based on how we manage a forest. And so this is total fuel load. So I said before that surface fuel was really important when it came to fire behavior. And this is just a control where we haven't done any prescribed fire and surface fuel load is 50 tons per acre. And then where we have done prescribed fire and a mechanical treatment plus prescribed fire. Just the difference here is huge, right? Hopefully you can kind of appreciate this difference in the effectiveness of prescribed fire in reducing surface fuels. Okay, so I want to get back to this idea of the fire management triangle, because I think for me, in my opinion, a lot of our success will depend on the degree to which we are going to be able to collaborate among those three components of the fire triangle. So I'm trying to think here now from the perspective of the fire manager specifically, and how the fire manager can keep the landowners and the silviculturalists happy, specifically pyro-landowners and pyro-silviculturalists. How can we keep them happy? I think there are 4 points here. One is that We need to understand the pre-suppression fire regime and kind of how fire naturally occurred across the landscape. There's this idea of dregs that I want to talk about, disturbance regime guided silviculture. And then balancing this idea of process-based versus objective-based burning, which I'll get into a little bit with these upcoming slides, and then understanding and mitigating the perceived downsides to burning. Okay, so the natural fire regime, and I'm borrowing this slide here from Professor Scott Stevens from UC Berkeley. So the fire regime, the natural fire regime, is often kind of used as a guide, right? It's used as a guide for how we want our fire regime to be. To be clear, our fire regime now that we have is nothing like the natural fire regime that we had before fire suppression. But we do know a lot about the natural fire regime, what it was like before fire suppression. So usually the fire regime is described in terms of the effects on plants. And of course, there's more to an ecosystem than just plants. And I have a bias towards plants because I'm a vegetation ecologist and a forester. But typically, we think about a fire regime in terms of the effects on plants. The major attributes of a fire regime, they include a temporal attribute. So this is the idea of seasonality. So when did a fire occur? And then fire return interval. We know that most fires occurred in the late summer and early fall. Sometimes we see them occurring in the dormant season, so in the winter, and sometimes in the springtime as well. But the majority of them we know occurred in the late summer and early fall. Fire return interval, again, we have really good data on this, and it does vary by site. I think, in terms of a fire manager and learning about the fire return interval, there are good studies out there across a mixed conifer forest, and one could look up the fire return interval in the area where they're working. But in general terms, I think there's pretty good confidence that the fire return interval varied between 8 and 18 years with a lot of variability, right? That's one thing to remember, a lot of variability in terms of the time between fires. But in very general terms, this would be described as a frequent fire regime. The spatial attributes, that's another component of the fire regime. So there's the fire size, right? How big were they across the landscape? And we know that there's, again, a lot of variability here, from a lightning strike occurring and then just going out after just burning a tenth of an acre to a fire burning over hundreds of acres or 1,000 acres. And I think that, to a large degree, spatial attribute, this is a tricky one to try to replicate because we have very realistic constraints that we have across our landscape currently. We have houses, we have roads, we have water courses. And I think these, for the most part, these are going to define, the control points, if you will, or the constraints that we have when it comes to the size of prescribed fire. Okay, magnitude attributes. This is related to how the fire behaved, right? So we have fire line intensity, that's how much heat a fire produces, and then we have fire severity, which is the effect of that fire on vegetation. So we know that very generally we had so looking back at the fire return interval, which was a frequent fire return interval, we know that this led to, in general, a low fire intensity type of regime. I mean, we know that there was some hot fires that occurred that would kill big trees, but in general, a low fire intensity regime. Fire severity, again, I think that we have pretty good confidence that in general it was a low fire severity regime with some localized high severity effects, but for the most part, characteristic of a low fire severity regime. So this picture here on the left, this is a low intensity fire, right? It's also a low fire severity fire, because these flame lengths aren't nearly tall enough to kill these bigger trees that we see in this picture. But if these trees were smaller, if they were only 6 feet tall, then while it still might be a low intensity fire, it could very well be a high severity fire. So a lot depends, in terms of the severity. My point here is that it depends on the structure, on the forest structure that we are burning in. Okay, so I want to get to this idea of drag. So disturbance regime guided silviculture is this notion that we have in forest management that we are looking towards the natural disturbance regime as a guide for our management activity. And I think we could apply this to prescribed fires. I kind of worry about us trying to have perfect fires all the time. So fires that are perfect replicates or perfect surrogates of what we think of as the natural fire regime. And I think a way to give us some flexibility in terms of using prescribed fire and being okay with some variability is this idea of disturbance regime guided silviculture. So a fire regime has these different components that I just talked about: severity, frequency, and seasonality. And we know we're not going to mimic all of these things perfectly with our prescribed fires, but there are ways that we can kind of give ourselves a score of success when it comes to prescribed fire by looking at each of these things and how we are doing with replicating one versus the other. So this is an example here of how to quantify the degree to which our prescribed fire is in line with the natural fire regime. So we have a severity score. So my last fire, I gave my severity score 0.8 out of 1, so where 1 was a perfect score. And the reason I didn't get myself a perfect score is because I had 10% mortality. So it was a hot fire. 10% mortality is a little high. I wished it was a little bit less than that, so not a perfect score, but still like a pretty good score, right? And then we have a seasonality score. This was done it was actually late October, so a little bit late, but still definitely within the range of when we would expect a natural fire regime to have fires. So a good score, but not a perfect score. And then a frequency score. This is based on how long I waited until we did this prescribed fire. So it had been 16 years since the last one. Okay, so that's kind of towards the upper end of that median fire return interval of 8 years. This particular forest had, actually, excuse me, it was more like a 10 years between fires. And so I didn't hit that 10-year interval perfectly, but 16 years is pretty good. So I gave myself a 0.8 score. So 2.4 out of 3.0, I'd say that's pretty good. My point here is that we're never going to score a perfect score when it comes to using prescribed fire, but there are certainly different ways in which we can try to work toward maximizing our overall score, our overall kind of capacity to, again, not mimic, but try to get close to the natural fire regime. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of process-based burning versus objective-based burning. So process-based burning is this idea that fire is inherently good. We're just going to let it do its thing, right? So, and this is the notion that we do a prescribed fire and it was a success as long as we didn't have an escape that was too bad, right? And I think, in some ways this is actually a pretty good philosophy to have, because it means we want to have fire on the landscape. And it is an ecological process that and a fire probably is doing lots of good things that we can't even measure, right? There are impacts that the fire has on organisms that are adapted to fire that we are not necessarily even measuring, because it's a basic ecosystem process that should be there. But it's, there is an extreme way of thinking about this in terms of any fire is good. The problem that we have when we have that extreme philosophy is that we're not necessarily meeting the objectives that we have in a given forest. And so that brings me to the objective-based idea of burning, which is more outcome-driven, right? So we have basic objectives that we want to meet. Maybe it's a certain number of tons per acre that we want to consume, or a certain scorch heights that we want to have, or a certain level of mortality that we want to stay below. And I think there's also the risk of being too extreme when it comes to objective-based burning, where if we don't achieve a certain amount of surface fuel reduction, then it's a failure, right? So I think there's a balance here. That my point here is there's a balance between these two approaches that I think we need to consider. Understanding and mitigating the perceived downsides of burning. I think there's a number of questions, kind of moving in here now towards the end of the talk here. There's a number of questions that I think fire managers should be asking when they are talking to landowners and to silviculturalists, so to those who own the land and those that manage the forest on that land. The first is that what level of tree mortality are you okay with? Like we need to, all of the members of that triangle kind of need to be on the same page when it comes to the acceptable level of tree mortality. And if anyone in that group says the answer is none, that's really a deal breaker, because there has to be some give and take, and there has to be some level of mortality that's okay, because anyone who's done a prescribed fire knows that there will be inevitably there will be some mortality that comes along with it, some tree mortality that comes along. The next question here is, what level of crown scorching are you okay with? So assuming that some level of mortality, tree mortality was decided that it's okay, another very important question is for the trees that survive, what level of damage to those trees is acceptable? Okay, so again, if the answer is 0, it's going to be a deal breaker because we know that when we have fire, we get some we get some damage to trees. And when I say damage, in the specifically referring to crown damage in this case, that's related to crown scorching. I think it's just important, and I'm not getting into detail. I'm not going to suggest what level of crown scorch is acceptable versus not. That's really a decision that needs to be made by the landowner and the forester and the fire manager. Okay, what degree of surface fuel consumption are you hoping for? So I think this is an important question to ask, because this often will factor into the go, no-go decision. If fire can be done, but it's not going to consume much surface fuel, then that might be a reason to delay the prescribed fire and wait for better conditions. And so kind of what the expectations are in terms of surface fuel consumption, I think is an important question to ask and for everyone to be in agreement upon. What are the forest management goals, and what is the next planned treatment? So this is kind of fits in more broadly and I think does influence the way that a fire is done, right? So what are the forest management goals? Is it for timber? Is it for wildlife? It's probably going to be a combination of factors. But what are the overall objectives in a given forest? And importantly, what's the next planned treatment? Is it going to be a harvest? Is it going to be another prescribed fire? Like how is it's important to kind of understand how the landowner and the forest manager, how they intend to maintain low fire hazard in the future. Ideally, I think a prescribed fire is going to be based on a plan, and that plan has lots that goes into it. Fire modeling, information about the stand that's going to be burned, some type of action plan that describes how the prescribed fire is going to be carried out. And so I'm not going to get into tons of detail here about how that works, but just as an example, these are the prescription parameters from a recent prescribed fire that we had on university land, where the objectives were, I think, were fairly balanced. We wanted good fuel consumption, but we were okay with a fire that was kind of towards the hotter end, but not so hot that we had more than 10% tree mortality. So this is just an example. This is going to change, based on the local conditions, of course, and be based on lots of different factors. But this is just an example of the kind of fire behavior parameters and the environmental prescription that we had recently on university land. Okay, I think a lot of it actually comes down to when a prescribed fire is done and the give and take that happens between the landowner and between the forest manager and the fire manager. I've heard this several times coming from forest managers during prescribed fires. Go slower, right? They want the fire to go slower so that there's less damage to trees and the flame lengths are lower. I hear that all the time. And I also hear, for sometimes perfectly logical reasons, go faster, right? Because they have to get the job done and they have to get the fire. It can be a safety reason. They have to get the fire done by a certain time. And so, there's this give and take that has to occur, the forest manager and the fire manager. All right, so getting towards the end here, I think that there definitely needs to be some shared objectives. There's going to be differences in terms of people wanting the fire effect to result in achieving different objectives. There's going to be differences there. But during a fire, I think there has to be some shared objectives that folks have. This idea of making the fire count, which to me means consuming surface fuels. I think that's, a pretty important objective. Making the fire align with the disturbance regime as much as possible, but not being so focused on this that we don't do a fire because it's not a perfect replication of the natural fire regime. Okay, so I put in this idea of DREGS, disturbance regime guided silviculture, the G is in bold because that means guidance, right? So we want the natural fire regime to guide what we do. And then thirdly, make everyone want to do it again. So it's just hugely important to keep everyone happy so that there's this motivation to do the fire again, and hopefully bigger and better than before. Okay, this is kind of my vision. I started out this webinar with a little story about when I started. I think we can be here, and this is where we need to be here. Instead of a map of shame, I'd like to be giving a webinar where it's a map of success. And I'm able to kind of bring up a map that showed on a good fire day in the Sierra Nevada mixed-conifer forest, we had prescribed fires occurring all up and down the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada, which is where the mixed-conifer forest is. Like, this is, I think, what we ultimately need to get to. All right, so that's all I had for this webinar. Good luck to all you folks out there who are looking towards doing more prescribed fire. I do think we need it in terms of sustaining the mixed-conifer forest in the Sierra Nevada. Fire is an ecosystem process that we have manipulated in ways that have had negative effects on the sustainability of mixed-conifer forest. And so reintroducing fire at large scales is just, to me, a very important thing that we need to try to work towards. So fiat flama.